When the U.S. dropped charges against bin Laden for the attacks in Somalia, and after firmly established in Afghanistan under the Taliban, it was time for bin Laden to carry out the spectacular headline-grabbing attack on America he had dreamed of for so long. Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today we are discussing episode 5 of the modern history of Afghanistan, the origins and ideology of the Taliban, and their rise, fall, and return to power. So, let's get going. After scrupulous planning and preparation, on August 7, 1998, the U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya was simultaneously attacked by truck bombs, which combined killed 60 people and injured more than 200 others. The attack was carried out by an al-Qaeda affiliate group, but it was suspected that it was orchestrated by bin Laden, given that the day of the attack was the 8th anniversary of American forces arriving in Saudi Arabia to combat Saddam Hussein. This belief was confirmed when a Palestine man by the name of Muhammad Sadiq Hawadi was arrested attempting to enter Pakistan with a false passport. Under questioning, he confirmed that he was a member of al-Qaeda's network of terrorists, and he had been involved in the attack on the Nairobi embassy. In Washington, the Clinton administration began an intensive investigation using their vast intelligence network. They soon began to amass evidence that more attacks were in the pipeline, and that bin Laden was also attempting to obtain weapons of mass destruction in the form of chemical weapons to deploy against American population centers. Thus, bin Laden was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and for the first time, the American public at large knew of the man who had announced jihad against him. He had seemingly finally achieved his ambition of hurting America in enormous fashion, and his position as the premier jihadist leader had been secure. But there was a price to pay. A week later, on August 14, 1998, 4 U.S. Navy warships and 1 submarine cruising in the Arabian Sea began ejecting Tomahawk cruise missiles from their launchers. Once airborne, the missiles reconfigured themselves, extending their wings outward and flying north across Pakistani airspace before entering Afghanistan and attacking the training camps, where U.S. intelligence believed a summit of top al-Qaeda leaders was taking place, including bin Laden. The goal was to simultaneously eradicate as much of al-Qaeda's upper echelon as possible and abolish its ability to manufacture chemicals that could be weaponized. In the latter case, warships in the Red Sea also fired Tomahawk missiles at a site in al-Shifa in Sudan, which was believed to be creating chemical weapons for bin Laden. Both the training camps and al-Shifa took heavy damage in the attacks, where Taliban sources claiming 21 had been killed and many more injured, including civilians. Speaking to the American people, President Bill Clinton outlined his administration's intentions with the attack, stating, "Our target was terror. Our mission was clear: to strike at the network of radical groups affiliated with and funded by Osama bin Laden, perhaps the preeminent organizer and financer of international terrorism in the world today." The U.S. judged the operation as a success. However, bin Laden not only survived, but his prestige in the world of Islamic terrorists was elevated, with him seemingly being spared by God to continue his jihad against the West. Furthermore, the damage on al-Qaeda was nowhere near what the U.S. hoped, as the majority of those being trained at the camp were actually people preparing to join the ongoing insurgency against India in the disputed Kashmir region. Protests against the strike appeared in every major population center in Afghanistan, while Mullah Omar spoke out in public, personally attacking President Clinton over the strikes. Earlier in the week, Clinton had been forced to confess that he had been having an affair with Monica Lewinsky while he was in office. Omar accused the president of killing innocent people in Afghanistan to distract people in America from his shameful acts in office. Some of the Taliban took an additional step and even accused Lewinsky of being an Israeli intelligence agent on account of her Jewish heritage, who was ordered to blackmail Clinton into attacking Afghanistan. Regardless, the Taliban hosting al-Qaeda had, as some in Kabul had feared, brought the world's premier superpower knocking on their door for all the wrong reasons. But in that extraordinary week of 1998, Mullah Omar and the Taliban had a possibly more pressing emergency developing in the West. Less than 24 hours after bin Laden's attack on U.S. embassies, Taliban forces were embroiled in a battle with the Northern Alliance in Mazar-e-Shafar, where Iran had a consulate. The Shia's revolutionary government in Iran had sympathized with the largely Shia Northern Alliance against the Pashtun Taliban, much to the latter's anger. Consequently, a number of Iranian truck drivers had been captured and held by the Taliban, driving weapons and supplies to Northern Alliance groups. As Taliban forces encircled the consulate, a small group of them entered and killed 10 Iranian diplomats and a journalist. Omar claimed that the killers acted without authorization, but this did nothing to temper emotions in Iran's capital, Tehran, where the government of Ayatollah warned of a great war about to engulf the region. Making good on this promise, the Ayatollah deployed some 200,000 troops to the border, backed up by tanks and aircraft. The UN swiftly began a diplomatic effort between Iran, the Taliban, and Pakistan, who Iran was claiming had deployed combat aircraft in support of Omar's forces. This was the first time Mullah Omar had spoken to anyone from the UN, who wasn't from Asian countries, and in the eyes of many observers, the talk was seen as the first recognition of the Taliban as the legitimate government in Afghanistan, if not officially, then certainly practically. UN negotiations managed to avoid military action by Iran and achieved the release of 45 of the captured truck drivers and the bodies of the dead diplomats for burial. However, efforts to improve relations between Kabul and Tehran failed, leading to a ramping up of support for the Northern Alliance, who began receiving vehicles and even helicopters from Iran and Russia. In a peculiar twist in the story of world politics, therefore, the Taliban had managed to achieve something few others around the world could, and that was essentially putting Iran and the United States on the same page regarding their attitudes towards Afghanistan. At the same time, other governments were keeping a close eye on Afghanistan, which was increasingly looking as though it was a threat to nearly everyone with the Taliban's links to terrorism. Unable to guarantee their safety, the UN began pulling aid workers and diplomats out of Afghanistan after an Italian military officer was shot dead and a French journalist wounded in Kabul. Unfortunately, it was the Afghan people who suffered most by this decision, for often it was the only humanitarian and medical help they could get. Aside from al-Qaeda and the other groups fighting in Kashmir, the terrorist groups who made a base camp in Afghanistan were the religious movement of Uzbekistan, who waged a terrorist campaign in neighboring Central Asian countries. Other smaller groups with more focused ambitions, like establishing independent religious states in countries where majority populations were being oppressed, like China, had also found a home there. It seemed that by the dawn of the year 2000, the Taliban's Afghanistan was at the forefront of an impending wave of religious fundamentalism about to sweep across the world. It was the world training camp for religious fundamentalist terrorists, but it was not going unnoticed. By the year 2000, Afghanistan was lost in diplomatic wilderness, having been shunned by virtually every major country in the world for their housing and support of terrorist groups. This only reinforced the view that many Afghans had of the outside world that it was there to destroy them and their way of life, particularly with how the country was portrayed in the Western media over their treatment of its people. Later, Omar allowed education for women in Kabul. There was a girls' school that taught a select few from age 7 upwards, and eventually women were also allowed to train as medical professionals so that they would work in female sections of gender-segregated hospitals. But neither of these were universal across the world of the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. The problem with viewing the Taliban in this period is that it is unfair to compare them to a Western government with federal authority over smaller local governments who deal directly with their people. Instead, the Taliban government was more of a corporative affair with tribes and factions agreeing to work with Omar towards his political goals. But these goals were not laws. So, while some girls were given basic education in Kabul, the very notion of this happening out in the countryside was dismissed out of hand. Consequently, by 2000, the Taliban found that cracks were beginning to appear in the harmony of the organization. The Taliban's requirements for more and more men to leave their communities to fight against the Northern Alliance quickly bred resentment, as did the Taliban's taxation, both of which sapped local economies and undermined local leaders. Omar always blamed the lack of money in foreign aid that was withheld by the international community for much of the country's hardships. And so, when on January 13, 2000, Taliban guards stole the equivalent of $200,000 from the treasury they were supposed to be guarding, the country's economy came to a shuddering halt for several days. This only further served to hurt the ordinary Afghans, but organized opposition outside of fighting up north and the remaining gangs of bandits were few and far between. The Taliban's hand reached into every corner of the country, either through their followers or their religious police, who cracked down brutally on even the most minor infractions of the ways in which the Taliban dictated how the people should live. To openly voice dissent was to invite a terrible punishment on the culprit and their family. But Omar had already demonstrated that his grip on his forces was nowhere absolute. The situation worsened by a mass influx of foreign fighters into the country, each with their own ideology and political aims. And even after, he issued orders for Northern Alliance prisoners not to be killed in an attempt to temper the international community. Massacres continued unabated. Whether he supported the assassinations of men and boys and the raping of women and girls in the North was irrelevant, for the fact remains that at times, Taliban forces were completely out of control. Omar found himself in a position that had plagued many leaders in Kabul preceding him. His Kabul-centric viewpoint and his efforts to liaison with the international community led to faction leaders out in the countryside accusing him of losing sight of the true Afghan way of life. However, he remained relatively unchallenged. On February 6, 2000, the plight of the civilian population under the Taliban was briefly thrust into the world spotlight again, when two brothers, Ali and Muhammad Safi, led a group of 9 men who proceeded to hijack a Boeing 727 belonging to Afghanistan's national airline. The aircraft was on an international flight between Kabul and Mazar-e-Sharif, but once the hijackers had taken control, they ordered the pilots to fly instead to the United Kingdom, where they landed in Stansted Airport after 2 refueling stops, including one in Moscow. The hijacking ended on February 10th, when the men were arrested by British authorities. During questioning, the men explained that they had taken this dramatic and dangerous step in order to escape the Taliban regime, and while convicted criminals, it was agreed by a British court that extraditing them back to Afghanistan was a violation of their human rights, as it would certainly be similar to torture and death. In the wake of the hijacking, more attention was paid on the Taliban's treatment of the people under its control and its links to extremism. Later that year, the country was hit by a serious drought that threatened thousands of Afghan lives. But despite appeals from the Taliban to the international community for aid, only a trickle of what was needed came through, as the prevailing belief was that it would mostly be pilfered by the Taliban for themselves, or that the aid workers would be taken hostage, as happened when a group of Western teachers were arrested and accused of promoting Christianity. Meanwhile, the war with the Northern Alliance waged on, and in July, the Taliban launched a fresh summer offensive against their old enemies north of Kabul. This included a number of Soviet-era tanks and aircraft, yet they proved unable to make any significant gains. And so in July, they launched another offensive in the northeast of the capital city. Their primary objective was to cut off the Northern Alliance's supply line from Tajikistan, and this saw indiscriminate bombing of civilian population centers suspected of being loyal to their enemy. Some 150,000 Afghan refugees took the dangerous path of attempting to flee to Tajikistan to escape the bombing. In response, the U.S. placed more and more sanctions on Afghanistan, and thus becoming more and more isolated from the international community. Omar saw no further reason to protect the Bamiyan Buddhas, and on February 26, 2001, he had them destroyed. The world looked on at Afghanistan as a near-medieval country now completely out of control. But again, the Western population viewed the situation as someone else's dilemma. How could it possibly impact them in any substantial way? That was still the dominant thought on one relatively routine Tuesday morning in New York City, September 2001. To be continued. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments down below. Be safe,